I'm like the crocodile, and the tears of me are wet. Right, let's see what we can do about that. Can you see me now?
I can see you now. How are you, Dave? Hi.
I'm yes, I'm here. That's the important part.
Well, thank you for chatting with me for just a minute. So
Good.
we just like to sort of kick this off and just say, tell us a little bit about yourself and, your background and everything.
I was born South African and emigrated to Australia about 15 years ago. I live on a little remote island in the middle of the Bass Strait. It's also part of the Roaring Forties from sailing fame you may know of, which is why we're having gale force winds at the moment. I hope the noise of won't bother you too much. I was a fisheries scientist, or ichthyologist to be precise, and I blundered into writing because I heard the spelling requirements were easier. Didn't help. I still can't spell. Actually, the whole truth of the matter is I started writing quite late, or in my 30s, because when I was at school in my final year, having been an absolute misery to every master that ever had to deal with me, I went to my English master, who I'd given an unrelenting hard time for 5 years, and I said to him, "Sir, I've thought about it, and I think I want to become a novelist." And he turned to me and he said, "Freya, you can't spell and you can't make a living at it." Now, I'm sure this was just a throwaway comment on his part, but it does go to show how seriously kids take often things that you say in jest. And he was dead right about the not spelling very well part. I'm like Shakespeare, I can spell everything at least 12 different ways, which I feel very sorry for my editors about. So I went off and thought, well, I can't do that. What else do I know anything about or care anything about? And my thought was, well, actually, right now, all I care about is going off to the army, which as a conscript I had to do for 2 years. And I didn't think very much further on the subject until I got out of that. I was a medic. Yeah, it was the Angolan War. It was not much fun. Anyway, I got out of there and I met up with a really nice girl who went rock climbing. And she said, "Well, what are you going to do with the rest of your life?" And I said, "Well, the only thing I know anything about is fish." So I went off to do fishery science, ichthyology, and ended up going off to do my master's on the commercial shark fishery, which is a sort of typical thing for me. I always start off with good intentions of doing very sensible, mild things, and somehow all these insane things happen to me. That's a story of how I came to write half my books, because people said to me, "Oh, you can't do that." And I said, "Just watch." Sometimes it works. This time, Cedar said to me, "Well, we're having this, we're opening up this books for young boys thing, but you know, I think you do really well at it." And for once, I actually thought, well, I'll prove her wrong. So now we'll see whether she's right or wrong. I enjoyed writing the book because it gave me a chance to write about an issue that was always meant quite a lot to me and was kind of current at the time. Some people in Australia had found a magpie. Now, these are very common Australian birds. They're not related to your European magpie. They're noisy little buggers. And somebody had kicked it out of, well, it had been kicked out of the nest for some reason. They couldn't put it back. So they did what so many other people did. They raised this bird and it became best friends with their bull terrier. And they put videos of the thing up on YouTube, and people liked the bird playing dead with a dog and jumping all over the dog and things like that. And then, of course, the bureaucrats got involved and said, how dare you take this wild animal and, you know, you should have just left it to die. Yeah. So it was a issue that cropped up, I believe, in your American things where bureaucrats decided that the process was far more important than the outcome. And so there I had the setting for a story that I wanted to write. And after all, what I know anything about, which is not an awful lot, is marine things and fish. Yeah, I grew up sort of between two worlds. Yeah. My dad was a linguist, and on weekends he went fishing on this little, what they called a semi-commercial boat, which was 32 feet long, converted whaleboat with an old diesel engine. And God knows how they ever got in and out, but they used to go fishing in this thing and they fished commercially. So I grew up kind of between two worlds, you know, very much a working class fishing world, which Dad loved. And I mean, I spent as much time as I possibly could. You know, one of my earliest memories is falling into the harbor. Yeah, I dropped the old man's knife into the harbor. I had to go in. I've been told to take care of it. Anyway, I got out alive somehow, I think, and here I am. Anyway, so do you have any questions you want to ask me, or are you going to listen to me yabber?
Well, just a few. How did you fall in with Raconteur Press?
Oh, well, I have known several of the protagonists for many years, and I happen to think it's a really great thing they're doing, and I wanted to support it in any way I could. Whether writing for them is supporting it is something I'll leave to the audiences to decide. But yeah, I think they're doing a great job, particularly in the short fiction area, which I believe is a fantastic training ground for people writing anything. Poetry is very out of fashion. I'm quite sad about that, which is very weird to hear from somebody like me. But poetry forces you to condense thoughts and emotions and sometimes a whole story into a very tight and sometimes prescribed framework. Short stories are the same. They teach a lot of the skills that you need to write a great long story. If you can write a short story, you have the skills to write a novel. If you can write a novel, you do not necessarily have the skills to write a short story. And I feel the same is true about writing for children. If you can't write for adults, you certainly can't write for children. They're actually a much harder audience. You have to control your language, you have to control your concepts, but you're still trying to convey a really important and complex story. And you've got to make it exciting and interesting and move fast, especially for boys, because they won't pay any attention after a fairly short time. So those are just my opinions on the subject, which I'm probably wrong about, but hey, they're mine. Like the crocodile, the tears of me are wet.
What do you like to read, and what kind of a reader would you say you are?
I think the kindest word would be Catholic, as in read everything and anything. I will literally read the labels on shampoo bottles if I'm in the bathroom and stuck there. I prefer to read fantasy and science fiction, but I have read everything from translations of Mein Kampf, which was really boring, to Das Kapital, to Ayn Rand. If it's written and you don't tie it down fairly thoroughly, I will probably read it. This includes my sister's Mills and Boon. Do you guys have an American equivalent? They're soppy romances written to a formula.
Very much so.
I read those. I've read all the Georgette Hayes that are available. I've read an awful lot of historical fiction. And of course, I choose to read a lot of science fiction. The science fiction I like has a strong problem solving aspect to it. And this is kind of one of the things I feel is missing in so much of the romantasy which I've read. They rely on these mysterious sparkly powers, and there's very little problem solving in them. Boys like to solve problems. I mean, my favorite illustration of this is the girl who comes along and says to her boyfriend, "Oh, I have this problem," etc., and then gets very disgruntled because he, instead of listening to her, promptly tries to solve the problem, which is a very male thing. And it's reflected, I think, it's not universal, of course. There are girls who are just like that. I married one. My son's married ones, but it's certainly not reflected in a lot of the books available to young boys.
What was your motivation, and can you describe the world a little bit?
Well, I can describe the world a lot easier than the motivations. Motivations are things that characters have, or ought to have. Sometimes I do things just for no particularly good reason. And that's why writing fiction is so much more complicated than real life. The world I wrote about, okay, because my background is in science, I have to make everything work. I am one of those terrible authors that spends hours actually calculating how fast the dragon would fall, how big the wings have to be, how much it has to weigh, how could it possibly carry a person? You know, I'm a real disappointment to the fantasy, hey, it's magic, it just happens world, because I like to calculate things, and it's a terrible flaw, and I'm sorry, but that's me. I thought long and hard about tidal worlds because I spent a lot of my life influenced by tides. Time and tide certainly wait for no man as far as fishing for a living is concerned. And the world changes so much when the tide changes. It's something that I suppose living in the middle of a country, people are not really aware of. But for much of my life, I've lived by the tides. No, it's 7 o'clock. I'm sorry, we've got to go now. It'll be low tide in half an hour, and I've got to be there, and so on. So, yeah, I wrote a highly tidal world where life is booming because it's very volcanic. So there's a lot of nutrients around, and the oceans are full of things which mostly, as in all real oceans, would happily eat anything, and you included, if they get half a chance. I kept fish because I was a fishery scientist. And one of the things that I kind of discovered about most fish is they would eat anything that could fit inside their gape. Okay, so we could tell how big a prey item they could take by how big their mouths were. They would literally eat anything they could swallow. And they weren't fussy if it was their little sister or their siblings. In fact, one of the more common demersal target species, one of my friends has this theory that most of the plankton that is principally the food source out there, there's not much else, is too small for their gill rakers. Does it make any sense? They have little teeth on their gills to stop the food that they swallow going out. So if they're swallowing little planktonic things, if it's too small, it'll go straight back out again. But their juveniles have small enough teeth on the gill rakers to catch these little prey items, and they breed prolifically. And his theory was they breed so prolifically so they can eat their own juveniles. Now, there's a story for a science fiction novel, and it is quite plausibly real, which is just like the background for Storm Dragon. A lot of fish are electrosensitive. We are not particularly electrosensitive, unless you believe in seeing auras, which are possibly an electrosensitive phenomenon. But all life forms have electrical fields of some kind, and more complicatedly, electrical fields at depth. So an electrical sensitive thing would not only be seeing the outside of you, it would be seeing parts of the inside of you. So if you think about it, where is a lot of electrical activity happening in your body? In your head, right? So in theory, at least, it would be aware of changes in your brain patterns because sorry, heavy science. Okay. But that was the idea behind Storm Dragon itself, was based on something called an electric eel, which lives in really nasty, murky water, where it's too muddy most of the time for it to see. And as an end result, it has developed electrosensitivity. A lot of fish have it. And so it can actually, by this detecting electrical fields, spot prey. It also, as you might know from the electrical eel story, can project one hell of a shock. It has electrical natural batteries, which it charges up. And I think, if I'm right, it does about 800 volts. When you think of what your voltage in your plugs is, you can imagine it packs quite a wall. I had a sort of a close and personal encounter with while we were net sampling in one of the rivers, and we pulled up an electric ray, which is a similar kind of animal. And all the fish around it were dead because it had shocked them. So we looked at it and we peered at it and we did all the things that curious biologists always do. The lady biologist in the book is, I'm afraid, based entirely on life. I've known quite a lot of them like that. Not that I'm like that at all. Anyway, so there it was, and we looked at it and we measured it and whatever. And then we were doing a sampling for density and species count and so on. So as soon as we'd counted each fish, they went straight back. But because this thing had shocked everything around it, it got left. And after we cleared out all the rest of the fish and we carefully moved it around with a rubber flipper, because we'd swum to put out the net, I said, well, what are we going to do with this? Oh, someone said, well, put it back. It's biological batteries. It's used them up now. And I picked it up. And I can tell you, they recharge their batteries quite quickly. Okay, so I've met one of these things up close and personal. And so with this in mind, I thought, well, I would design an animal that could sense electrical fields, including electrical fields in the brains of its own species and presumably any species it came across. And as all of our thoughts are electrical transmissions, basically, over a short range, it could appear to be telepathic. And it can also, of course, pack quite a shock because that's what it does. It uses electricity just like our electric eels and electric rays do, A, for defense, and B, for possibly catching their prey. And I modeled the animal a bit on dolphins, so it likes to play. And there we go. There we have a creature. Now I just had to come up, as authors do, with motivations for why it would be there and what would happen in the story. And authors work backwards. We often have the idea of where we want to go, and then we have to have motives as to why the characters would get there. So I gradually worked backwards into the story that I hope everyone will enjoy. And I tried to write it on boy characters who were real enough, but also very much part of their families, because so many of the books you encounter are all about dysfunctional families. And I thought, hey, why not model it on kind of family that I grew up in, that so many other kids would like to grow up in, at least. And actually is a lot more normal than some of the weird ones that always end up in the books. Anyway, what else have you got to ask?
I love how much you drew on your own expertise in ichthyology. I would expect that kind of dense knowledge base to go into an adult's book. Why what was the attraction of making this a boy's book?
But I told you it's much easier to write an adult book than a one for younger people. I mean, I think it was C.S. Lewis who originally said that, but it could have been Kipling, one of the two of them, you know. So why would I choose the easier path? Have I ever chosen the easier path in anything in my life? No. So, right, I had to write a book about complicated ideas, which would hopefully be accessible to readers who didn't have the framework yet for all that. So I like to make life difficult for myself.
And what do you want your readers to walk away with after they've read your book?
I'm hoping they'll walk away happy having enjoyed the book. That's my first and primary requirement for all the books that I write. To go off on a slight tangent, fortunately, I started reading long before I ended up at school being subjected to some of the books, which for many of the boys there were the first books they'd really had to read on their own and were probably the last books they ever read, voluntarily, that was. I thought it was a far better idea to addict kids to reading and make sure they read lots and enjoyed lots of reading before subjecting them to something that would effectively cut them off from a magnificent world of the imagination, that whole ocean that we can sail out onto. It's so full of exciting unknown things. It makes so much broader of any human being who enjoys reading. I feel we're betraying these kids when we give them something they don't enjoy that's going to put them off books for the rest of their lives. I mean, yeah, obviously, I'd love them to role model on some of my kids, not all of them. There are villains, there are always villains, but kids are going to meet monsters and dragons of human sorts in the rest of their lives. They're going to face difficulties. I want to give them the imaginary tools or imagination tools to be able to fight their way through these things, to work on solutions, to take challenges and realize that, yeah, you can think your way around them. And I want them to come out of there feeling lifted up and hopeful and eager to go and get it and to go and do stupid things. I can remember, I must have been about 7 or 8, I decided I was going to conquer the world by distilling rust. And then I would make rust bombs. So I spent vast amounts of time boiling rust to make concentrated rust. Now, don't ask me where I got this idea from, but that was probably from some of the books that I'd read. I was strongly influenced by my first ever science fiction book, which is satire, but I just thought was absolutely brilliant, which is a thing called The Blue World by an author called Jack Vance, which has humans crash landed onto a planet which has no land, and they live on floating plants. These huge drifts of basically sea lilies. So they have no metals and they have no wood, and they have to solve all the problems. And the only place to get things like metals is by taking their own blood, which has got iron in it, and burning it down in huge quantities to get tiny amounts of iron. And as a small boy, I thought this was just the best book I had ever read. And I completely missed the point of the fact that these people were convicts who now thought themselves, well, ancestors were convicts who now thought themselves to be heroes and seriously put upon, because all the recorded writing from the time was from the convicts' point of view, who, of course, were all absolutely innocent. And, this was just the typical prisoner situation where they certainly never did anything to deserve this. But yeah, I think books are a big key to kids' imaginations, and that is a big key to building up great adults and a great society. And I've never seen the point of these people who say, oh, well, it doesn't matter if you don't read. That's like being blind. You know, if you could choose to give someone vision and not do it, how could you do that?
Is there anything I haven't asked you that you'd like to just mention about your writing, your book, your life?
Just think anybody can write or do anything they really set their minds to. Sometimes not very well, because I'm living proof of jack of all trades. I probably know a little bit about fish, but I've ended up doing everything from picking up a house and putting it on a truck and driving it up a hill and then taking it off again by myself, which everyone will tell you is tantamount to rain insanity and couldn't be a way of making life harder for yourself if you tried. I think you should have a go. And I'm a great believer. One of the few Australian concepts I really love is that Australia has the hero as a battler. Now, a battler is somewhat different to a winner. A battler might die having lost everything, but he's been knocked down repeatedly. Every time he just gets up again and starts again. And it's very much a frontier concept because, especially on the Australian frontier, but I doubt it was that different on the American frontier. You didn't really know it was coming. You got going great, and things came along and ate your crops or destroyed everything you had. And you had two choices. You could either just die, or you could get up and do it again. And when the next thing came and ate your crops, you could get up and do it again. And that's the core of the whole Australian battler philosophy. And it was very much part of the South African frontier philosophy, and I should imagine very much part of the American frontier as well. And yes, we're heading for new frontiers. We're going out into space. We're going to get knocked down. People will die. We're going to do it again and again and again until we get it right. Okay, that's me.
Dave, thank you so much. This has been lovely. I can't wait to see your book come out Friday for us, Saturday for you. Thank you so much for talking with me and for doing this book with Raconteur Press.
Okay, here then. Bye.